many ways, you'll see some of the connections, because certainly the time frame is the same. I'm looking, as it says on here, gay activism in the 1950s and 60s. But my research is focused in a very different way. So what I'm looking at is two of the earliest organizations, and as I said, I don't entirely know what was discussed today, aside from what I saw in the syllabus. But I look at two of the earliest organizations, the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Believers, which were both in California. Mattachine started in Los Angeles, and the Daughters were in San Francisco. And I'm especially interested in conflict within organizations. I look at how conflict changes the organizations, how organizations deal with conflict, and then in the case of my dissertation, I'm hoping to do this second step, which is how conflict actually creates the opportunity for movement emergence. So I won't actually have the opportunity to talk about the movement as much, but I will get to it at the end, because that's actually sort of where I am with my research now. So as Doran said, we met at this retreat. I actually had a whole series of data that I was looking at, and my plan was just to start with the historical narrative to get a sense of really what was happening with the Daughters. I wrote my thesis on the Mattachine Society, and I have a really good sense of the organization in its early years. And I was sort of under the impression that the Daughters sort of had the same trajectory, that they were founded at this time when it was sort of unexpected. They experienced this internal strife, and that led to organizational change. What I discovered on the second day of the retreat was that I was totally wrong. So of course that means that you have to sort of shift your understanding of how organizations act, how it can potentially be a catalyst for movements and things like that. So this is sort of the first time in discussing it since I had this realization that conflict may or may not lead to schism and organization change. But regardless, I still think it holds that it is the conflict itself that was a huge catalyst for the movement. So as I said, I'm going to start with the organizations. I thought it would help to get a sense of what the socio-political environment was like at the time. Again, it seems like you actually discussed that a bit today. But again, this is much more focused, again, on the sort of structure of homosexuality as something distinct from heterosexuality. They don't talk about transgenders, transsexual, until a little bit later, and then it actually did become pretty important to both organizations. But as it says here, the period of World War II and just after was characterized by these fears of communism and anxiety of waning masculinity. Again, just sort of the one slide I saw, I think that's especially pertinent into the case of the first sort of successful transsexual surgery and somebody coming home and how that was defined, right? It could have been seen as this conflict of masculinity when the men were coming home from war and were expected to sort of go back to their places within factories and the jobs, and women were expected to go back to their homes and sort of abandon everything they had been doing. So there was great concern over these changing gender roles that had taken place during World War II. And there was a lot of overlap between terms such as sex criminal and pervert and psychopath and homosexuality, and all of them were really conflated. If you were homosexual, you were seen as one, if not all, of all these other terms. And this era sort of represented this restorative trend, this attempt of the U.S. and the government to make sure that men were men and women were women. So as early as 1947, Congress began expressing concerns over homosexuality in the government because they felt that if communism was sort of the threat that the State Department was facing, then homosexuality was seen as this deviance that sort of had opened people up to the potential to become communists, right? It was almost as though if you were homosexual, you were also likely to be communist. So it was sort of seen as this maladjustment that led people to be open to communism, or a better term, maybe receptive. So one of the most important turning points prior to any kind of activism or organizing was actually the Kinsey Report. So as you just heard, it was published in 1948, but the public actually saw this as a major threat. So they actually thought that homosexuality was only present in a really small percentage of Americans, and that it was a very specific thing, and of course, Kinsey didn't see it that way, right? It sort of changed the way people were thinking about it. Several homosexuals, on the other hand, saw that as an opportunity. They were realizing they weren't this really, tiny 1% of deviance, that it actually sort of represented this larger scale, and they were an organizable majority, as some of the earlier activists saw it. And it's really important that they saw this sense that they could organize around this identity. So like I said, one of the best ways to get a sense of the emergence of the movement is through these early organizations. one of the sort of interesting things, sort of sociologically in my perspective, or that I'm arguing in my dissertation, is that most social movement literature finds that there's activism and there's social movement, protests and activities, and then organizations come from that. Once there's sort of enough people that are interested in this cause, then organizations will develop. They use the goals of the movement to identify their own goals, and then the movement can expand. What I found, and what I'm arguing, is actually the opposite. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the social movement literature is wrong, but that we sort of need to expand our understanding. Because in this case, we have two organizations that existed before any kind of sort of large-scale organizing, and the movement then came from that. So I don't know if any of you have studied sociology or some of the classical theorists, but Max Weber was sort of one of the earliest ones who looked at organizations and movements that come from it. So a lot of people and a lot of researchers still sort of use him as the foundation. He was the first to say that we'll see a movement and then organizations. And here we're actually going to see the opposite. I was really happy that I wasn't wrong about that, because then I would have a big problem making a strong case for my case. All right, so up here there's a picture of Harry Hay. He was an active member of the Communist Party and was a teacher and organizer at the People's Songs, which is part of the People's Education Center of the American Communist Party in Los Angeles and in downtown. Both of these obviously were leftist organizations. The really interesting thing is he was really interested in organizing itself. So he had a very clear sense of how can you start an organization given the threats that he faced initially as a communist, because he was not out, he was married, he had 2 children. But he was really interested in, once the Kinsey Report came out, he is an organizer. How can I organize this, what he described as a cultural minority? He actually first proposed the idea on August 10th of 1948. He met with a group of men who were interested in the Wallace campaign. So they started this organization called the Bachelors for Wallace, and he was this candidate. They were all going to support sort of using the People's Education Center and using some of their leftist identifications. But he proposed that homosexuality could do the same, or the homosexuals could do the same things that communists did, and they would have power in numbers as this minority. Of course, they were all sort of drunk at the time. Apparently, they wrote it out on this big sheet of butcher paper, which is no longer in existence, unfortunately. But the next morning, I guess they all sort of came to their senses and realized there's just no way we could do this. But Harry Hay wasn't swayed, so he sort of tucked it away and kept bringing it up when the occasion would allow. So he wrote this prospectus that outlined the goals of the organizations and looked for like-minded individuals that weren't happy with the status quo. So the individuals that he spoke to were interested but wouldn't join until they had some sort of sponsorship or some sort of recognition as an organization. And of course, anybody that could serve as a sponsor or a support wouldn't do that unless they had members. So there was this bit of a conundrum where he potentially had members that they wanted to see sponsors, and he potentially had sponsors that they wanted to see members. So it took 2 years, but he finally recruited 4 individuals. So Harry Hay is actually the top left, so he's lost a bit of hair since that earlier picture. And then at the bottom, there's Rudy Gehrenreich, Chuck Rowland, Bob Hall, and Daryl Jennings. So they were what he called the Fifth Order, and I'll explain that in a second. And then there's 2 other members in here, Stan Witt and who was the other one? Paul Bernard. Both of whom were active in Mattachine, but were not these founding members. So, like I said, these are what we call the Fifth Order. So since Hay was really familiar with communism and organizing in secret, he had discovered the organization that the Freemasons of the 18th century used to maintain their secrecy. And interestingly, it was also used during Prohibition by liquor dealers. So he was basically borrowing an organizational structure from these groups that knew that they had to sort of do everything they were doing in secret, and even within members of their own organization, they didn't really want everybody to know who they were, because it really left them vulnerable. And Hay in particular was already being monitored by the FBI and had a file because of his work with the Communist Party. So at the top was the Fifth Order, and like I said, the members, their names and identities were hidden from the lower members. There were initially supposed to be 5 orders, only 3 of them came into existence. The first member orders, they were recruited through what he called discussion groups. So the idea was that they were going to try to find other homosexuals, or we didn't use the term, or they didn't, I was not alive, they didn't use the term allies at the time, but the idea was that they wanted to find people who wanted to talk about just generally what does it mean to be homosexual? How can we maybe start where Kinsey sort of had his work published scientifically and think about what it means to us as homosexuals to be organizing? So they had what they just called discussion groups, where they talked about these various topics. And then they also had the Second Order. So these were members of the Fifth Order who would basically go out and recruit and be the connections in between these two orders. And the idea with the Freemason structure that they used was that the cells, you couldn't, if you were in a bottom cell, you couldn't see up, and if you were in a top cell, you couldn't see down. So really only the second order members had a sense of the discussion groups that were in their circles, if you will. I wish I had thought to actually scan this document. It's one of the oldest ones. It's from 1952 that I have. And essentially it looks like this. So you have a first order, and then you have these second order guilds, and then below that you have various discussion groups. So the second order members could only see here and up, and then the same goes throughout, right? So there was some degree of anonymity in that. So with their early goals was they were founded to bring together this group of isolated individuals to affirm their identity as a cultural minority and to dispel the fears of the community about homosexuality. The idea that they were a cultural minority was really important for Hay, because again, he was a Marxist scholar. He wanted to identify, he wanted people to see that there was a difference between sort of homosexuals and how they identified and the rest of the community. But at the same time, it was really important that that difference didn't cause problems. So it was an interesting balance between we're different, but we're just like you. And of course, that was going to cause conflict as the movement expanded, because it was sort of a difficult idea for people to wrap their head around. But one of the other things they wanted to do, in addition to having people be okay, let the community members be okay with homosexuals in general, is they did want to integrate themselves in society, and they wanted to do that by being involved with research. They thought that they should help psychiatrists and psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists and all these different individuals, some of whom were at UCLA. They wanted to be involved with the research studies because they felt like if they could get involved with professionals, it could give them some legitimacy to what they were saying. But that too actually became a major bone of contention with some of the later discussion groups. And again, I'll get to that in a bit. So throughout 1950 and 1951, the original group of five were able to slowly recruit some individuals. So in social movements, a turning point is typically what we call an event or a series of events that change the trajectory of either an organization or a movement. I heard Dawn refer to a turning point before in terms of, when we see one person who had successfully gone from male to female and has, an operation that allows them to have, again, a turning point and others see it, then you sort of see it expand. And the same thing happens in movements. You need some event that allows people to sort of see what's going on, maybe get behind the scenes a little bit. So the desire for secrecy meant that the organization had a really difficult time recruiting at the beginning. People don't really want to be out because, again, homosexuality was conflated with sexual deviance and communism. So they had to find a way to recruit people into this organization. And that changed in 1952 when Dale Jennings, who was one of the founding members, was arrested for lewd behavior. So this was a really common thing that happened at the time, where the police would go to male cruising areas and basically engage in police entrapment. They would try to trick men into either engaging in behaviors or honestly arrest them for doing absolutely nothing but claim that they were doing things. During the 1950s, nobody really wanted to fight these charges or face jail time, so it was usually a tactic that was used for blackmail or to elicit money from various people. So in order to keep Mattachine a secret, they did think that it was a good idea to fight the charges. Dale Jennings claimed he didn't do anything wrong. The archives show that there's sort of two different stories, but regardless, Mattachine said it shouldn't matter. They're going to fight these charges, but they didn't want the organization to be vulnerable because of that. So they created a front group, again, which is something that a lot of communist groups did at the time. They created an organization called the Citizen Committee to Outlaw Entrapment. So what this sort of separate organization did was reframe what this group was doing. So instead of, again, saying this is about homosexuality and education and integration, this organization essentially was saying, anybody is vulnerable to these charges of police entrapment. It doesn't matter who you are. You could have a family and you could lose your job. So everybody should get involved. So they actually published some little pamphlets. They handed them out everywhere. And they wanted to get people involved in what was going on. Mattachine had a very small membership fee, and they were able to use that to hire an attorney named Fred Snyder to help fight the charges. What ended up happening was that there was a mistrial. All of the jurors, I believe it was a 12-jury trial, 11 jurors actually voted to acquit, and the 12th would not, he abstained. So there was a mistrial, and the judge essentially dismissed it. Apparently the police officer who made the claims of, that Dale Jennings was engaging in this lewd behavior was found caught in a lie. So the judge dismissed the case, And Mattachine saw this as a victory, because it was the first time that somebody openly said in court that he was a homosexual but did not engage in these behaviors, and there was really no fallout from it. He didn't lose his job. So Mattachine saw this as a victory. You can now say you're homosexual, and the courts have said that in and of itself is not a punishable offense. And again, this isn't LA. There are very different things going around in different cities around the US at the time. It would have been different in DC. And it actually would have been different in San Francisco and New York, which were, of course, more liberal than LA at this time. So after this success, Mattachine, they received a little bit of publicity, and as I said, so it's the first instance of a collective effort to fight such charges. So it was seen as this success, but they weren't getting sort of the media recognition they wanted. So what Mattachine did is they started publishing, small newsletters. The discussion groups expanded, so there were about 24 guilds, and again, the guilds are what they called the first order groups. And they were able to at least talk about it a little through the CCOE, right? There still was officially no Mattachine. But with this expansion, the secrecy was starting to become an issue. So Mattachine sort of decided, all right, we can admit now to being homosexual. There's still a problem around organizing. So they reframed the movement again, they reframed the organization and decided to incorporate in the state of California. And in 1952, under the name of the Mattachine Foundation, which again was still distinct from the society, they officially became an organization. Because Harry Hay, again, was being targeted by the FBI and already had the files, they used the name of Harry Hay's mother and one of the other founding members' sisters. So it was Romaine Cox, and unfortunately I can't remember the name of Harry Hay's mother. And he was called out by this gentleman, Paul Coates. So he was sort of looking into it. He got his hands on this questionnaire that the Mattachine members had sent to various council members prior to an election. And they were introducing themselves as the Mattachine Foundation, and they wanted to know where these various council members stood on political issues. Paul Coates published this article that on the one hand said, oh, look at this potentially is this very strong organization. Who knows what kind of political effect, homosexuals can have once they're organized. We should be aware of this. But on the other, he called out Harry Hay as a Marxist teacher, and he called into question who the founders were. He said that he tried to get in touch with Romaine Cox, who again sort of wasn't affiliated with the organization except in name. And he also identified Fred Snyder, who had been defending Dale Jennings during the trial, and realized that he had been called in front of the House Un-American Committee. During the Red Scare, right? That's going to drive me nuts. House
Un-American Activities.
Thank you. House Un-American Activities Committee. This is why I normally do. And that he was considered a sympathizer, right? So he said, this is really problematic. On the one hand, this is potentially this majority that can have political power. On the other, are they really communists? And who is this Romaine Cox? And we don't know anything about this. So surprisingly, despite the fact that it's pretty obvious red baiting, and they were trying to get Mattachine to sort of respond to some of these communist issues, what they did instead was they sent a copy of this article to every member of Mattachine and to all the discussion groups. Oops, I better go to the next slide. Yes, there you go. So they sent this letter around to all the discussion groups thinking, this is great media attention, Mattachine's finally getting out there. But the Laguna chapter in particular were really scared off by this idea that they were being run by a group of communists. They didn't really know anything about the people up here, which of course was how it was supposed to be. And it was pitched to everybody as this sort of, secrecy. But because the discussion groups were popping up so quickly, a lot of times they didn't know about any other group aside from the Citizens Committee to Outlaw Entrapment. They didn't really know who was behind Mattachine or what was Mattachine. So the Laguna Beach members, or the Laguna members, called for this loyalty. In addition to that, the Fifth Order had this sense that perhaps it's best if Harry Hay sort of takes a step back, isn't as involved in the group in case, the FBI decides to come to their meetings and sort of report on what they're doing. And they decided it's probably best to have everybody come together, and they decided to hold this Democratic Convention in May of 1953, where they were going to sort of openly discuss the structure and the goals of Mattachine. Wow, that was fast. Okay, so these two coalitions developed, the founders and their supporters, and this dissenting group. So these were the three primary oppositions from the dissenters. they opposed this idea of homosexuality as a culture. They saw this as something that was much more closely tied, to Marxism and communism. They also didn't think it was their job to educate the community. They said there's a better left professionals. Who are we to say anything about homosexuality? All we want to do is sort of integrate and be like everybody else. And finally, they didn't think it was their job to have any sort of political involvement. So despite the fact that the founders and their supporters were a much larger coalition, the dissenting group was much louder, and all of the founding members ended up stepping down, and the dissenting group took over. So what happened here is a lot of the founding members just left. Others joined other organizations, and very few remained involved for more than a year. I'm going to go really quickly through this. I didn't realize that would take almost 20 minutes. So the Daughters of Bilitis was the first lesbian organization, and it started in San Francisco. So in this picture, you see Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin, who are two of the most well-known and longest-running activists. You can see that they just have a really successful career with their work as activists. So they started this group in 1955 with 3 other couples. It was initially supposed to be this sort of alternative to the bar scene, sort of a social organization for women. But they did have these 3 qualifications for membership. One, you must be a woman interested in promoting an educational program on the subject of sex variation and for sex variance. Must be 21 years of age and provide documents of proof, and must be of good moral character. So from the beginning, it was pretty apparent that there was going to be conflict because, for one, they were using phrases like sex variant, which of course at the time was pretty accepted. But again, most of them didn't think that was important, right? They didn't want to be educating; they wanted to be a social group. So within a year, 2 of the original couples dropped out, and it did become this more political organization. And you could see that they borrowed some of their early goals from Mattachine. They wanted to integrate, they wanted to educate themselves and the public, and they wanted to participate in research projects. So I'm skipping ahead of it so we have a chance to get more. So what was more problematic at the outset was not necessarily these political goals, especially once those other 2 couples left. The problem was their decision to be public right away. Unlike the men who actually already had these public spaces to congregate, and who of course at this time already had this, something of victory, a lot of the women had families and risked losing their children. So even if they weren't with, their husbands anymore, they felt a different type of threat than the men did. So membership growth was slow. So here you'll see the Ladder, which was the Daughters' sort of national review, and they started publishing this really quickly. So they were able to sort of, get the word out to what they were doing. They found several newsstands across the country that were willing to carry it. And on each issue, they had the purpose statement on the inside, and that had the 4 goals. So again, people knew this organization. They decided to go public. And much like Mattachine, they actually did register with the state of California. When chapters sprang up in New York, they quickly began working with other organizations. So here we're starting to see the networks develop. The New York chapter started working with 4 other organizations. There was a Mattachine chapter in New York and 3 other groups. Even though the early constitution that the Daughters came up with explicitly restricted them from actually engaging in work with other organizations. But they sort of felt like there's no other way for them to get any of these goals accomplished, especially if they, were so far away. They're on the East Coast, the national chapters in San Francisco. The New York chapter also had several members. So, several younger members. So on the cover here is Ernestine Eckstein, which is actually a fake name which many women use. She was 24 years old. She'd been involved in the civil rights movement in college. This is actually an issue from 1966. But her, along with a lot of the New York members, really wanted to be involved in direct action, in protest. They didn't think that just sort of, sitting around and talking and publishing the newsletter was enough. They really thought that they should be out on the streets, getting involved. Because at the time, especially 1966, the civil rights movement is, well on its way. There's a lot of public action. And they saw this as the opportunity for the Daughters and for other homosexual organizations at the time to also get involved. But, actually, as she said in the issue, I think this is a great quote. She said, "Demonstrations, as far as I'm concerned, are one of the very first steps towards changing society." And when she talks about changing society, this is a really different goal than what the earlier Daughters had in mind, which again was about changing the variant, or understanding the variant. So I know I'm trying to condense what happened here in 10 years into 2 slides. And I had more explanation before, but again, I sort of want the opportunity to move ahead a little bit. So this sort of represented one of the conflicts, and that was sort of the generational thing. The younger women wanted direct action and wanted to work not just with the homophile organizations. And I don't know if you discussed the phrase homophile. It was selected by some of these organizations because homosexual had such a negative connotation, and homophile had been used by groups in Europe. So that's where the term homophile movement comes from. So these women wanted to maintain, the older women wanted to maintain ties with the homophile organization, but weren't as interested in feminism and the women's movement and civil rights movement. The younger activists saw this as an opportunity to build what they were doing and to gather support. Because just as Ernestine Eckstein said, their battles are our battles. What she was seeing in the homophile movement was just as the same as what she argued she was experiencing in the civil rights movement. So a quick note, this picture is clearly not from the homophile movement, but it shows the marriage of Martin and Lyon, who were, the ceremony was performed by Gavin Newsom in 2008 when marriage was briefly legalized before Prop 8. Although he had performed several ceremonies before the court overturned it, and then it went through the courts and it was okay for, again, that brief 3-month period, this was the only ceremony that he performed. So they got to be the first couple legally married in the state of California. But it's also sort of a good way to tie in sort of the last chapter of the Daughters. So the conflict wasn't limited to the East Coast. Lyon and Martin were also becoming really frustrated, particularly by the national chapter, because they were more affiliated with the San Francisco chapter. They wanted to get involved with this organization of different leaders, or a coalition. It's called the Council for Religion and Homosexuality, the CRH. Council of Religion and Homosexual. They changed their name several times, so it's a little difficult to keep up, again, when I'm sort of condensing things. So they wanted to get involved in this coalition of leaders of various organizations and church groups, because they saw the church as a really central place to get people to start changing their minds about what it means to be homosexual. Again, by the late 60s, this is something that was being borrowed from the civil rights movement. They saw the success of the churches in the South to mobilize African Americans, and they thought, well, we need to use the churches as well. There's much more of a difficult history there, but they saw that this was going to be a really effective maneuver. The Daughters of Believers was totally against it, so they actually withdrew their membership and became inactive. So by this time, we start to see the organization dissolve a little bit. So whereas Mattachine had this really short history of 1950 to 1953, and again, it continued on, we see a very explicit change in the organization. In the Daughters, what we see is years and years of conflict, really from the time they started in 1955. They went until 1971. They certainly started to dissolve once Lyon and Martin were not active, although they still recognized membership in the group. It was inactive membership. But with this organization, you don't see the conflict rising to the same level. I'm not sure why that is. Part of it is the organization was smaller. Part of it is that within the Constitution, they had conventions every 2 years where a new governing board was elected, so they had the opportunity for everyone to come together. Also, I think because they were much more dispersed, there wasn't the same proximity as Mattachine, they were able to kind of ignore some of the issues in the Constitution, like don't get involved with other organizations. So while Mattachine members left the organization, or they split to develop their own, the Daughters were able to sort of have joint membership at that time. And what we're seeing is that this actually is happening sort of concurrently with what we're identifying as the homophile movement. So I'm going to do this one slide, and then I'll sort of stop there. But as I said, what's happening with the Daughters coincides with the homophile movement. So it emerged slowly as these groups began discussing discrimination. There's little agreement on the date of the beginning of this movement, which is in part why so few scholars actually study it, especially within sociology, where unfortunately we have to sort of reify everything and put a bit of a boundary on it. So we do have a few historians. There's maybe half a dozen sociologists who look at this movement. But that's part of the reason, again. So there's no start date. It's hard for us to get a sense of really what is a movement, and is this classified as a movement. So in terms of mobilization, we typically say that a movement will emerge when there's a base to organize activists, and it has to have shared group interests. And of course, that's the problem here. So we certainly have a base of organizing activists, right? But they seem to be going in different directions. And it's the shared group interest that's really problematic. At the 1962 convention of the Daughters of Believers, they actually had a keynote speaker who basically rejected any acknowledgement of the homophile movement. That was actually the title of the speech, Is There a Homophile Movement? Or maybe it was Why There's No Homophile Movement. But that's what he was looking at. He's like, we can speak about this and we can talk about all these organizations of homosexuals, but he saw them as so distinct and unorganized that there was in fact no movement. And this is sort of where I am in my research right now, is one, sort of identifying, I think in retrospect we can look back and say certainly there was a movement. If nothing else, we see the success of Mattachine with the Dale Jennings trial, and then the expansion of all these organizations. There were a dozen chapters of Mattachine, there's Janus, there's all these organizations over the U.S. But sort of being able to define these shared group interests is really tough. So sometimes difficult also to come in here when you're sort of halfway through a research project and be able to explain exactly what the homophile movement is, what its goals are. The major issue is that there's conflict, right? Are they integrationists? Is this a separate cultural minority? Obviously, after Stonewall and gay liberation, there's much more structured goals. The idea of integration, it sort of fizzled away a bit. People didn't think women should be wearing, skirts. It was okay for women, and men at the time they called it swishy, right? Nobody was supposed to be, flamboyant in any way. They had to be men. So they're still borrowing from the frames that existed at the time. And as this is changing, we see a movement sort of struggling to identify itself. So I apologize for going so quickly. I just looked at the clock on my computer and had to go through it. So
it's really wonderful to sort of hear you praise some of what's going on in relation to some of the historical change that we've been looking at and the kinds of pressures, the social pressures through which, or within which, a movement and an identity is forming. So thank you so much.
And if you'd like, I have a really interesting archives, and I unfortunately left them in my office over the weekend when I was planning. But they have really specific things. For example, what the women should wear to conventions. So, they had to wear skirts, and the same thing with the men. So if I can get the chance, I can scan them and email them if you want to put them on the school's website. So again, it's all about this identity formation. But of course, they didn't apologize.
I know some of you have to run off, but if anybody wants to stay and ask Molly